Hi, I'm Jeremy Ruston, Head of Open Source Innovation at BT. I'm also talking without slides, so you can take the opportunity to rest your eyes if you'd like to, but you'll miss a rare opportunity to see me in a suit. I figured that an open source event was exactly the kind of occasion when I should wear a suit. So I'm builder speaking on, I think, how to start an open source project, but thinking about it, I realized that actually who, why, how, and when are all reasonable questions to ask about starting an open source project. A little bit about myself first. About 3 years ago, I started a project called TiddlyWiki, and you can tell immediately that I didn't have plans for world domination because I wouldn't have chosen such a ludicrous name if I'd expected anybody else apart from me and my mother to use the damn thing. And it grew over these last 3 years into a substantial open source project. I would like to think one of, I think, your silver category of the 1,000-odd projects that's got a big enough community of a few dozen people who are contributing tens of hours a week to the project and a few hundred people who keep their hand in, if you like. And I actually ended up at BT through acquisition. As part of BT's interest in open source, they acquired my company Osmosoft, actually just me, earlier on this year, and given me the opportunity to grow it into a group within BT. And so you'll see outside there's a pod for Osmosoft, and about 8 of our guys are here. So any of the stuff that I'm talking about here or any of our other activities, do come and talk to us at lunchtime about that stuff. For most of today, we've been talking about open source as if it was just an artifact that we found lying around on the beach. And we've not really given much thought to where all this open source software came from in the first place. And that's really what I want to address, because I think for BT to be a serious player in open source, it's not just about us understanding the risks of using it and being able to exploit it, but also to contribute back to the community. And one of the things that I hope that that will mean over the next few years is that we take a leadership role in some open source projects. Now, I'm talking about myself. This is an individual story. It's one guy starting a project. And obviously some open source projects are actually started by corporates, and you might think that a story in the future about BT starting an open source project might not have much relationship to an individual. But I think actually that even in big corporations, big enterprises, when they start open source projects, it's always about people. There's always somebody passionate in the middle of it who's going to lead the project. Okay, so we'll take those questions in what seemed like a sensible order. Who, why, how, when, and then a couple of other points. And as I say, there are as many open source stories as there are love stories. I can talk about mine, I can try and generalize it a little, but really it's for us as a group to make some of these judgments ourselves. So the first thing about who I've established, I think, which is that you really need somebody who cares to run this stuff. One of the hallmarks of open source projects, everybody talks about the people with beards and sandals, and we tend to get kind of confused by the fact that these people are geeks. But it's not the fact that they're geeks that's their chief characteristic, I would say. It's that they're enthusiasts and they have a strong self-belief. They're actually more like entrepreneurs. We laugh at them because of their clothes, but these are people who have the kind of drive and self-belief that we'd normally associate with a Richard Branson. Anyway, and so I also hope that who will be you, the people in this group, already established that that this is the core engineering group within BT that thinks it understands open source. So if anybody's going to do this stuff, I hope it will be you lot. So then there's a question of why. And there are some really bad reasons for starting an open source project. I spent some years as a CTO of a variety of .coms that were VC funded, which gave me a fantastic opportunity to spend a lot of time with people who were really nothing like me. And two fantastic things that I encountered was people's response to the problem, oh shit, we haven't got enough developers, we can't afford enough developers. And you would get CEOs saying, why don't we open source it? And then the elves will come out at night and finish the software for us. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but here we're very resource crunched, and particularly we really don't have, I think we'd all agree, we don't have enough hardcore technical experience. Certainly in the development space, we could always do with more. And so it is very tempting to think that you can do that. And of course, if we do successfully start an open source project, that is in fact a way to access some other brains outside the company, but it certainly shouldn't be a prime motivation. Another bizarre thing I see is people who have a great idea people who might therefore be kind of biz dev people. They've thought of a fantastic proposition, and they don't have the technical chops or the money to implement it, so they decide they're going to open source it. And in fact, of your hundreds of thousands of open source projects, I believe an awful lot of them are little more than a spec. I mean, certainly if you go onto SourceForge, there's a remarkable number that have no code, which seems a very curious thing. And it's very difficult to get traction, obviously, if you don't have any code. So in terms of the positive reasons for why you might want to do it, I think a driver for a lot of people is because they've made something cool and they want other people to share in it. And certainly for me, I'd made something that I was proud of and I thought was interesting for other people. And I couldn't pursue it down a conventional VC-backed business model for a variety of reasons. It was a very natural open source project. But open sourcing it gave me a way to get it out there. And so it's really about driving adoption. So one of the, I often say that software, it's a sort of insane sounding metaphor, but it sometimes makes sense to treat software as if it was alive. And by that I mean that software, we might think of it as a symbiotic organism that lives on the back of a host geek. The metaphor is that we all know what dead software looks like. Software that isn't connected to a host geek. Something like, IE6, just sits there, might get the occasional security patch, but it can no longer respond to its environment. It's little more than a decomposing corpse in the corner. So somewhere linked in with the health of software is that there's people involved in it as well. The symbiosis of people who care and the software itself. And so if you've made something cool, you want to get it into that state, then making it open source makes that possible. One of the other things that hit me was having made this damn thing and put it out on the internet and enjoyed tremendously the reaction that it got. An immediate problem was that I couldn't actually deal with the support workload, as in people emailing me saying, what is this thing, what does it do, why can't I make it work on my microwave oven and stuff. So in fact, I was just coping with dozens and dozens of emails direct to me, and starting a discussion group was just a way of spreading that around so that it wasn't me that had to feel that I had to sit there and reply to 8 emails a day. A very common motivation for open sourcing things, particularly amongst corporations, is to try and establish it as a commodity. And we talked about how open source has traditionally worked very well in infrastructure areas, in areas where there's a common commodity that you're not seeking to leverage for profit. So it's not a differentiating factor. But if you've got some piece of technology that you want to establish as a common standard, open sourcing it is a very common approach. And even Microsoft do it. So now when Microsoft want their non-standard extensions to RSS to get adopted, they try and use the language of open source to do so. Another reason for building making something into an open source project is to build a community. This is partly about the support thing. So when I was talking about not having to support TiddlyWiki because I had a discussion group, what was actually happening, and I was too stupid to realize it, was that a community was building around TiddlyWiki without me having to do anything particularly purposeful other than to sign up for Google Groups. And we'll talk more about community, but from many perspectives, the magical things that happen in open source happen through the community. There's nothing, we're building software with the same tools, the same basic capabilities as the proprietary world. What's fundamentally different, and it's still developers sitting in front of a screen writing code, the thing that's fundamentally different is the presence of a community. There's 2 other points I'd like to mention on the why we might do this. And one of them is about understanding what users want. So a common problem, I think, for a lot of us in software is the requirements process. And in fact, it can cripple. We've all seen projects, I think, which have been crippled either by a long-winded requirements gathering process, which never seems to come to an end because you can't get agreement, or a requirements gathering process that's been rushed and you end up with a particularly poor capture of the end user's user interface requirements that can then lead to a well-intentioned system being a complete failure. And one of the reasons, there's many reasons for that, of course, and I wouldn't pretend to solve all those problems, but one of them is that our fundamental tool for finding out requirements is to go and talk to people, to ask them what they want. In the If you lived next door, what kind of bathroom would you like? And it's elementary psychology that when you ask people questions, their answers are seldom a guide to their future behaviour. People answer questions in a way that will make them sound clever or funny, or they've got a whole bunch of reasons that are more to do with the conversation they're in than giving a reasonable answer. Plus, often we're not sure. You know, who knows what I want this dialog box to look like? I've not even used the damn system yet. So we're forced, therefore, to second guess what the requirements are. In an open source project, one of the things that are totally new to me when I started was the way that by observing what people do, you can see what's important. But when I say observing what people do, I don't mean by observing what they say. I'm talking about observing what they put effort into. And you can measure effort in several ways without even being particularly analytical about it. There are people in the TiddlyWiki project who post to the message boards many times a day, a dozen times a day or more. So you get some indication from them as to what they think is important, but also the code contributions that I get. So when people send in a patch for TiddlyWiki, even if the patch itself is of low quality, and we'll return to that later, at least I know that somebody cared enough about this feature or this change or this bug to put the patch together. So as I say, it's about understanding requirements, being able to observe users' behavior, where they're doing stuff that has cost them some effort or some money or some energy. And you can see that because everything that happens in the open source project is sufficiently public and transparent that you can see what's going on. And the final reason I've mentioned is that often we don't know what the advantages of open sourcing things are going to be. It enables serendipity in a way that's really impossible if you're planning everything in a military-style proprietary way. So as an example, with TiddlyWiki, I had certain ideas in my head about what it was good for. And if it had been possible to build it up into a conventional VC-backed company, I guess I would have pursued those ideas because they seemed like the most obvious ones. But by open sourcing it, what actually happened was that people applied TiddlyWiki to dozens and dozens of areas completely independently and regardless of what I thought. And the great success that I'd paid no attention to was in the education market. That a bunch of people who were involved in education saw TiddlyWiki, recognized something in it that fixed, that talked to some of the problems they face in education. And we had 3 completely independent adoptions of TiddlyWiki where an open source project and a proprietary project and a private project, all 3 of them decided to adopt and integrate TiddlyWiki to varying degrees. So now suddenly TiddlyWiki has a great education story, which I had absolutely nothing to do with. And not only did I fail to anticipate it, but I didn't even do anything to foster it. So those are some of the reasons why we might start an open source project. And I also mentioned when, which is really to give me a chance to repeat something that I said before, which is that you really, really, really need to wait until you've got some code before you start an open source project. Otherwise, you've started a standards group, which is a completely different thing. So the rule of thumb is you need something that's big enough to see. You need to have written enough code that other people can see and understand your vision, but not enough code that you bricked yourself into a corner that when all the other people join in, you realize your mistake. So a couple of points on when, and finally it's how that gets interesting. Again, I don't know what I said again, sorry. The primary things you need to get an open source project started is a license, and we've already talked, I think you had a taxonomy of 3 licenses, and there's lots of reasons for choosing different licenses, and I wouldn't seek to give comprehensive advice for that. But in the case of TiddlyWiki, my goal was to drive adoption. I wanted as many people as possible to use the damn thing, and the BSD license is very good for that. And I think that's often the case for us as well. All things being equal, we want people to use our stuff. And whilst I wouldn't pretend to be able to generalize about every project, personally very keen on the BSD license, and it's worked extremely well for us. Then you need to publish your code, and I'm sure I'm teaching people to suck eggs here, but the conventional way to publish code is on a Subversion repository so that anybody can see it. So in the case of Osmosoft, we check our code into our Subversion repository at the end of every night so that people can inspect it alongside us. And you need a forum for discussions. bizarrely, open source projects tend to be much more conservative than you'd expect. So given that the open source projects are populated substantially by technology geeks, you might expect them to be based on the most elaborate collaborative Web 2.0 hubs, but in fact not at all. Almost all open source projects use 1956 era email lists. And in fact, I think it's partly because, as we've already seen here, open source people tend to be running Linux and God knows what on almost any device. And the great thing about email, even though it may be a terrible thing in a corporate environment, is that for us, it does at least give you the ability to read these messages on any device. Open source projects always benefit from having a roadmap. It's a simple device to try and capture some of your vision for where the project is going. And of course, you need a public and open bug tracker, which gives you a way to acknowledge your bugs and gives you a mechanism to fix them. And wrapped around that, you need a patch process. So this is the heart of open source, is the idea that you can publish a piece of software, the users in using it discover problems and shortcomings or discover enhancements that they think would be attractive, and they send you a patch with the results, and then you fold that into the master copy of the code, having tested it, and then bang, your product has got better. In my experience, and this seems to be shared by some open source projects, but I'm sure not all, the quality of the patches is actually really poor, to the extent that I've almost never taken patches apart from the 2 or 3 people who, over time have become part of the core group. And that seemed really surprising at first, because as I say, it seems like the whole blinking point is that you've got all the elves out there around the world writing the software. But as I say, it turns out that writing software is only a small part of running these projects. We all know from our day jobs here that the actual process of writing code is 10% or less, depending on who you talk to, the overall activities we do to grow and sustain a piece of software. So point there being that it doesn't actually matter that you're not accepting the patches, because there's a marginal quantity of them. But as I said before, it's not so much about getting a bug fix, it's getting an insight into your users that's the real value of patches. So if you get 2 or 3 patches arriving for a similar problem, you've got a very strong indication that people really care about that issue. Partly in response to this thing about patches being often poor quality, you've then got a problem, because you've got a whole load of people who we know care about the project enough to want to send in a patch. They want to see it change. But as I've already said, the chances are you can't accept the patch. Chances are, unless they're in your inner core group of contributors, they don't quite understand enough of the whole project to make a decent patch. So what do you do instead? And a common feature of many open source projects is that they're actually an ecosystem that includes particularly a plugin mechanism or a theming mechanism or something. And then that gives you the structure of core code that's managed very tightly, and as I say, you tend to expect to reject patches. And then an environment around it in which anybody can innovate. So a great example would be WordPress. WordPress's core code is run in a very conventional way, in a very conservative way. But there's a sea of plugins out there. And actually, the innovation in WordPress is in the plugins. And the same situation happens in TiddlyWiki. So it gives users who wish to contribute a safe place to contribute that doesn't threaten the core of the project. And it allows people to access what they have contributed as quickly as possible without, as I say, having to compromise the core of the project. It doesn't apply to every project, but even for those where a full plugin mechanism doesn't make sense, I think there's often things you can do to provide a safe area at the margins of the project, at the margins of the code for people to experiment in. Some open source projects also have non-profit foundations. I think you mentioned a couple of those. And I think for BT, this will become an increasingly important topic. So the problem is that as big corporates like BT sit down around the table of an open source project and bring their weight behind that open source project, that's fantastic from the point of view of individuals involved in the project. They get to benefit from our immense gravity well. But it can be scary for other organizations. Somebody who sees themselves as being competitive to BT or subservient to BT in some market may feel threatened to get involved in a project that they see BT as owning. So the standard way to deal with this is to set up a non-profit foundation. And this is something that I did for TiddlyWiki not long before the BT purchase, which was quite fortuitous as it turned out. So the idea is you have a non-profit foundation with a public board that everybody can see, public minutes, that owns the IPR to the product. So I actually had to sign over the IPR in TiddlyWiki. Well, originally the contract said in exchange for $1 because that's a standard consideration in legal contracts. But I made them change it to a bottle of champagne because I thought if I was going to take my cow to the market and come back with beans, it better be beans I can drink. It's not for everybody, and I waited 2 years before I did it. To begin with, I was worried that I would be yielding control and in some way, as I said, giving away my cow, giving away my livelihood. But it turns out that it really clears the air and makes it abundantly clear to anybody who wants to participate what the basis of their participation will be, what they can expect of the other contributors. And I think there's some situations where, on the buy side, we may prefer to deal with suppliers who have a non-profit foundation to own their IPR. So that's almost me done. I was going to draw together a couple more points. We talked about how the people in this room, I hope, are people who will be involved in, are already involved in contributing and founding open source projects. And I've met, through doing TiddlyWiki, a number of other people in a similar sort of situation. And I think I can draw out four characteristics that you might look for in an open source founder. And one I think of as optimism, but other people might think of it as something more entrepreneur-like. And it's the idea that you can see the outcome that you want before you get there, and you're capable of sticking with it. And some people are optimistic through, well, I sometimes think that I'm optimistic through stupidity, in the sense that I sometimes don't see all the terrible things that could go wrong. And certainly, open sourcing a project is a high-risk strategy. So if you're a natural pessimist and naturally conservative, perhaps it wouldn't be the right thing for you. The personal quality that has been most valuable, it turns out, is being patient and fair, because most of the time running an open source project, you're running a community. It's not unlike running a family or a team, except to this rather odd thing, the way that people can come and go as they please. They're not, they don't share any blood or money with you. That you have taste. I love the word taste. I like the idea that there are things that are important about what we do that can't be captured on simple lists. There's the result of a long experience of knowing what a nice piece of software looks like, knowing what an appropriate level of documentation should be. Without that taste, it's really hard to deal with the questions that come back from the community. And finally, in some sense, you need to be a leader. And I think a lot of good leaders don't know that they have those qualities, because there are only very few environments in the real world where people are able to be a leader. But the open source world is full of people who might not lead in any other situation or in any other social environment, but which have shown themselves to be strong and resourceful leaders. So those four things, optimism, patience, tastefulness, and the ability to lead, call me an optimist, but these are qualities that I see all around me in the BT engineering community. Nobody called me an optimist. So I'll finish with a summary. From the point of view of the founder of a project, what's in it what's in it for me to open source my project? So we had requirements insight, as in the ability to see what people want, scaling and sharing of the effort of support. To be fair, to some degree, fame and glory. A lot of people do open source projects for the perfectly reasonable reason. It makes them more visible, more likely to get hired somewhere else. And that's a perfectly fine thing to do. Adoption, because I'm an egomaniac and I want everybody to use my stuff. And the rather strange thing, again, that I didn't expect, that by open sourcing, it decouples the size of your organization from the size of your success. So TiddlyWiki, at a time when the number of people using it, the number of people who were getting support out of it and so on, I would have needed a company of 12 people to, just to operate TiddlyWiki like that. But by open sourcing it, I was able to keep it as just me. So for people who, people whose social comfort zone is perhaps to be in a smaller organization, open source seems to give you that flexibility. And yeah, and I wrote the final thing. What open source has given for me, which has been really cool, is faith in my fellow man. As I say, I worked for an investment bank and then for 2 different .coms, being in association, say, with some very different types of people. And it was fabulous at the turn of the millennium to discover that actually not everybody out there is a yuppie, and there are still some hippies out there. Thank you very much.